Oh, hi, everybody, and welcome to the 100th episode of Mattsplaining. Today, I have an expert on who is long overdue for a podcast of this type. Expert, please introduce yourself and tell us what you're an expert in.
My name is Reena. I am an attorney and practicing in New York. Here's my disclaimer. I am not anyone here's attorney. This is not legal advice, and I cannot legally hold myself out to be an expert in First Amendment, but it is my special interest.
So, the First Amendment, and remind our listeners what the First Amendment is.
Sure. So the First Amendment refers to the First Amendment of the United States Federal Constitution, which reads, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances.
Fantastic. I feel that I am pretty much an expert in the First Amendment myself. And I think that the most important thing that most people overlook when it comes to the First Amendment is the dynamic. My understanding of the First Amendment is that it does protect speech and it protects anybody in the United States and their right to speak freely, no matter what the consequences there may be. And that means, and that covers it in every potential market and circumstance that you can even imagine. So if somebody's writing something on Twitter, they're writing something on their Geospace page, on their MySpace page, any of these things, that is perfectly protected. And no, they should face no ramifications whatsoever for what they write, how bigoted it is, how phobic. So that is the fundamental thing. And that's what our founders, the founding fathers of the United States, were thinking, because they were like, we don't want people to get in trouble for when they find out that Benjamin Franklin has a bunch of dead bodies in his yard. We don't want them to be like, hey, thinking that Benjamin Franklin was a serial killer or Benjamin Franklin just like really liked dead bodies. I'm not saying that Benjamin Franklin wanted to create a Frankenstein, but he did want to create a Frankenstein's monster. Benjamin Frankenstein, the American Frankenstein, the American monster. He talked a lot about what it meant to be an ideal American, and since he couldn't convince the troglodytes of America to stop spitting in the streets, he wanted to create one by collecting all of these dead bodies and creating his own. And that's why he was trying to harness electricity with the key on the kite. And he just, much like Victor Frankenstein, was trying to harness electricity and bring it into this American. And people say, oh, what about Igor? What about those sorts of things? Who was it? And people might say it was John Hancock, but it wasn't John Hancock. It wasn't Alexander Hamilton or anybody like that. It was just one of the nice rent boys that Benjamin Franklin had with him pretty consistently, as we know. Benjamin Franklin, very fashionable, a very fashionable man. He wore a hat very often, a petticoat, and had the gout. And he thought all Americans should have the gout, and everybody had the right to get the gout and to provide information about what treatments they might be able to use to deal with the gout, such as that is protected under the freedom of speech, in that you can sell and say that your salves and your patent medicines and your snake oil treats the gout and fixes the gout without any ramifications, even though you don't have a degree in medicine, even though ultimately it does create a necrotic, flesh eating bacteria sort of situation, making the gout worse, but also curing the gout eventually because you do not have any feet left because it's eaten them away to the bone. And I think that that's what Benjamin Franklin wanted in the First Amendment. And he was one of the pioneers of what speech should be. He was really good at it. And ultimately, the freedom of speech was created to sell milk crates for people to stand upon in squares so they could get on their bully pulpit and talk. And that's what they really wanted. They really wanted that freedom of speech. So, like, the town square would be that place where anybody could buy a milk crate, stand upon it, and be like, hey, this is what I'm going. Because that's really what facilitated the United States' creation is the milk lobby really wanting to sell not just the milk, but what are we going to do with all these excess milk crates that we created?
Right.
And that's why they wanted freedom of speech.
Uh,
Now, based on what you've heard so far, about how much of that would you say was accurate?
I would say astonishingly little, considering that you also graduated from law school.
Well, my law school technically doesn't exist anymore. I did well, and most of the time in my constitutional law class was spent doing an impression of my constitutional law professors.
That was also true in mine, but I think that that's just a rite of passage.
Yeah, and I think that that makes a lot of sense, but my constitutional law professors then did go on to sue the school. So not because of me and my impression. My impressions was spot on. My common law one professor was very pleased. He was like, the Constitution is a living, breathing document. That's really good for how long ago it was, and like not hearing his voice consistently. So, Professor, if you're hearing this,
I also like that he's a textualist. He's not an originalist.
oh yeah, he's got to be. He's a textualist. Yeah, that's what he tried to instill in us, and I respect that.
Mhm.
Now, tell me about the First Amendment.
Yeah, so the First Amendment does a couple of things. First of all, it doesn't protect you from anybody but the government.
I see.
It does not protect you, unfortunately, from the consequences of your actions and your speech. If your private employer fires you because you went on a racist tirade, you're SOL. That the First Amendment has got nothing to do with you. But it also doesn't just protect speech, it also protects freedom of freedom of the press, freedom of religion, and freedom from religion, right to assemble, and right to petition the government as well. So there's a lot that's done in a short amount of time.
And how does it address Benjamin Franklin monsters?
That's a really good question that I feel like not enough legal case books are getting into the specifics of. I think that you hit on to actually a couple of interesting things there that weren't necessarily wrong. You had sort of even a broken clock moment there.
Well, see, here's the thing I think about broken clocks. Everybody has this presumption about, sorry to pontificate about broken clocks, but broken clocks, everybody thinks it's like, oh, it's set in one spot. And that's the thing. A broken clock can just be going from, it seems like there's a pretty big misconception in a lot of society about how the First Amendment works.
Absolutely. So I think that the biggest misconception is the one we already touched on, that the First Amendment means you can say whatever you want, whenever you want, without consequence, which is absolutely not what's intended to do. Its original intent, I think that the founders were sort of remarkably prescient in writing the First Amendment, because I think that what it really does at the end of the day is helps us to live in a pluralist society.
Mhm.
And for a bunch of white,
And that's a society where people can use plurals.
exactly, where everybody must speak in plurals at all times. No, that a society where people have differences of
I
opinion,
see.
of religion, of backgrounds, and that can talk about those differences freely in open space without fear of police knocking down the door. Although that still happens sometimes.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I understand that the Whiskey Rebellion was based upon that in a lot of ways because people talked about how we should ban whiskey,
Mhm.
and that basically facilitated the government being like, we need that whiskey. We can't have that. So we need to knock down those doors, even though they've done nothing wrong at that point.
Yeah, it really was like government fear over whiskey. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that, like, personally speaking, why I love the First Amendment, and also why I don't practice the First Amendment is First Amendment law, rather, is that I think that it represents both the best and the worst of us, because it really is about everything. It's about how, where, and when pornographers can make obscene things, where Nazis can hold rallies, but also these sort of loftier ideals about freedom and the free marketplace of ideas, and making sure that you're living in a society where you don't have a state established religion.
Hmm.
So I think that it's sort of the best and worst of where we are. And also my particular interest in it is that sometimes it's just goofy.
Right.
Sometimes it's just like the stupid stuff that we as a society have to get together and figure out where the limits are. My favorite of all time, it's the Bong Hits For Jesus case.
Bong Hits For Jesus. Absolutely.
The plaintiff was a teenage boy
Great.
who, like, again, we're this is First Amendment. You're off to a strong start.
Mhm.
Plaintiff was a teenage boy who, when the Olympic parade came past his high school in, I think, Alaska,
Great.
when like the teachers were all like, "Oh, kids, let's go outside and we'll like wave to them as the wave to the Olympic parade as they pass by," and they get out. And it's this like school sponsored essentially event, but not, it wasn't during school. He unfurls a giant banner that says "Bong Hits For Jesus" that gets on the
Mhm.
on the local news, and then he gets punished for it by his school.
Right.
And he
And it was
had,
a public school?
it was a public school, that being the state after his public
Mhm.
school. And he had a really good history teacher who he had recently taught him about the First Amendment. And he says, "Well, no, wait a minute. Isn't it, this was not during school hours. We were not on school grounds.
Mhm.
Why can't I say Bong Hits For Jesus?"
Right.
And sadly, the Supreme Court disagreed with him and said that the school had a protected right in discouraging speech that would encourage illegal drug use, I think, was the way that they sort of cut it.
Mm. Well, so that brings to mind Jimmy Buffett for me, because Jimmy Buffett has a song about his feet hurting, his head hurting, and how he doesn't love Jesus. And some people might say that that encourages alcohol use and getting drunk. If he survives by Thursday, he'll be roaring Friday night.
Mhm.
And that leads me to believe, why didn't Jimmy Buffett get in trouble for writing that song and distributing that song if this young gentleman didn't even have a recording contract and was just holding out at a banner? I just don't understand their reasoning there.
Yeah, what probably would be again that there's no state actor here.
Okay, so that
The government didn't punish Jimmy Buffett is the problem.
well,
You would think they should have.
I think that I'm not saying anything. I'm not advocating for. I'm not saying that we
Right.
should reclaim the Margaritavilles by force or anything like that.
But
And
listen, Matt, it is your constitutional right to sort of vaguely allude to storming the Margaritavilles.
okay, and so long as I don't take active steps, I would be protected in the First Amendment so long as the government didn't say, hey, you can't say that, and get me in trouble for saying, maybe I do want to storm the Margaritaville.
So there's a couple things that are going on here. One is the idea of a true threat, which
Okay.
is the idea, and there's a Supreme Court case, I think last season, about this, which was essentially there was a man who had said, and this is not this is not what you're doing, but a lot of the guys who are the plaintiffs in First
Mhm.
Amendment cases are not the best dudes in the world.
Okay.
I'm going to talk about how bad this dude is. He was unwell, and he sent hundreds of messages, I think maybe in thousands, to a musician that he liked over Facebook, I think. But some of them were quite threatening, and it was
Mhm.
frightening for her because she didn't know him, and she was trying to begin her career and that sort of thing, and he wouldn't stop.
Mhm.
And the Supreme Court basically said that he didn't mean to. He wasn't trying to threaten her. So it doesn't matter that she felt threatened, which is it's a wild decision. But
Cool.
the other thing that you were sort of talking about, it brings up the other sort of big category restrictions that the government can impose, which is a time, place, manner restriction.
Okay.
I want to have a rally. Well, okay, you can have it at 5 p.m. That's the time, the
Mhm.
place, on this street, and the manner. You can't like light shit on fire while you do it.
Right.
Time, place, manner restrictions, which are generally okay.
Mhm. Yeah, so like that, if I were to want to take over the Margaritaville,
Right.
so they might
Allegedly.
allegedly,
Mhm.
they might put a time place restriction on that. They might say we can't sell alcohol during that event, that rally that I'm having to
To
use.
promote the idea that one should,
One should. I get
one
my
even
milk.
could, perhaps not even
Yeah,
should, one
I
could
get
storm
I
the
get my
Margaritaville.
tequila crate
Mhm.
and I put it down in the town square, and then I start talking about how the Margaritaville is you know, a a regime that needs to come down
Mhm.
because they're selling their margaritas at too high of a price,
Mhm.
and they don't have enough gluten-free options as well as enough
Right.
desserts. The desserts leave a lot to be desired. I mean,
Mhm.
some people would argue that the drinks are the desserts, but like it's a lifestyle. Each drink is like there's not enough pairings. There should be. What I'm saying is,
So,
in my Margaritaville, there's a 5-course tasting menu,
right.
and
So
they
here's the
don't
problem,
have that.
though, Matt, is that you get into another restriction, which is you work for the government.
Well, I don't know that I work for the government.
One works for the government.
One might work for the
If
government.
one worked for the government
Mhm.
and was saying these things, the government is playing two roles here. The government is the employer
I see.
and is potentially the government actor for the purposes of the First Amendment that could be restricting speech. So there's a whole other body of case law that's just for people who are employed by the government. And
Mm.
what can you or can you not say when you're employed by the government? And what can
Oh.
you get fired for, basically?
Okay, so that's a very interesting dynamic that I may have wanted to review prior to doing 100 episodes of a podcast where I talk about very stupid ideas that I may or may not have come up with in the minutes before the podcast was
Uh-huh.
recorded. Cool. If you had advice for somebody who was interested in the First Amendment or gets frustrated when people misapply the First Amendment, what would you
Right.
tell them to look at? Or is there common things that they could focus on to help better explain the First Amendment?
Sure. I mean, I think that there's unfortunately kind of a dearth of things that are specific to the First Amendment out there,
Mhm.
but there's a lot of great stuff on constitutional law.
I see.
Because there's a podcast put out by Slate. It's very good. That's, I think, really good commentary. NPR frequently does really good commentary. Here's the thing. First Amendment law, like any other kind of law, is evolving. Like like your con law professor would say, it's a living document.
Living, breathing document. See, it's getting better the more I do it. I haven't heard this man's voice in over a decade.
But I think one of the best ways is to see if there are any First Amendment cases that are coming up on the Supreme Court's calendar this season, and then read around them when they come up, because a lot of times these cases that are coming up will give you a background on how we got to where we are
Mhm.
and where we think the court might be going. And there are actually a couple of really interesting ones that are coming up where we've actually already had oral arguments but haven't had decisions yet. So there are things to look out that will really, I think, potentially change the landscape of what First Amendment looks like, because one of the evolving issues is, what do we do online?
Right.
What is the online space in terms of the marketplace of ideas? Who controls it? What is the government's interaction with it? And there's a lot of really interesting cases that came. Well, here's the other thing.
Mhm.
So you're talking about gout and your God-given right to spread misinformation about gout.
Mhm.
But there was actually a case in front of the court
About gout?
yeah, about gout. About COVID misinformation.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
And the government's ability to go to social media companies and say to them, hey, look, we need you to begin curtailing this misinformation or people are going to die.
Right.
And I think I'm trying to remember if they already came out with a decision, and I feel like they did already. And they basically said like that was legitimate. If the government were to be straying into giving penalties for not removing misinformation or something like that, it might stray. But if it's just a conversation where the government is sharing their concerns, then that doesn't rise to the level of First Amendment violation. But you can see in terms of regulating online spaces where that can get increasingly more complicated.
Right. It goes so far beyond putting your tequila crate in the town square or your milk crate in the town square and like yelling for everybody. It's if you have the right hook, you can reach millions of people with that information so easily.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of it is just how shitty can you be on the internet before the government has to step in?
Right. Right.
Like that's the thing. It's like it can be sort of really lofty and then it can be really basic all at the same time.
Absolutely. Reena, I can't thank you enough for joining me today and clarifying a lot of this information that I had. I found it absolutely fantastic, and I can't thank you enough. As a non-expert, is there anything that you want to say since you have the freedom of speech?
Since I have the freedom of speech,
To close us out, is there anything you want to leave our listeners with since you have the freedom of speech to say what you want?
Bong Hits For Jesus.
Fantastic. My name is Matt Storrs, and this has been Mattsplaining. Before we go today, I want to thank Ryan Lawson, my dear friend, for making the theme music for Mattsplaining. Ryan can be reached at beatblenderstudios@gmail.com or at Beat Blender Studios on Instagram and TikTok.